Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen-Chi. Semiconductor supply chain resilience is of great interest to many people who believe that the sector grew out of decades of globalization and trade liberalization, but now has to find a new business model to satisfy national and economic security concerns with growing geopolitical tensions. Today, we have ORVILLE Schell of Asia Society and Larry Diamond of the Hoover Institution, two familiar faces to those who pay a lot of attention to China, Taiwan, and democracy. Their newly edited book, Silicon Triangle, the US-TAIWAN-CHINA and Global Semiconductor Security, examines this already complex triangular relationship that is now further complicated by the increasing competition for advanced microchips. Welcome, Larry and ORVILLE.
Great to be here.
If you can share with us, how the idea of Silicon Triangle came about. It sounds like it started as a working group project. And what was the main concern or problem you were hoping to explore?
Well, it started because some friends and I started reading about the incredibly important role of TSMC in one of the most important commodities in the world today, namely microchips. And as tensions began to heat up in the Taiwan Straits, it occurred to me this is really sort of an anomalous situation to have a company that makes them sitting right on the edge of an earthquake fault. So I went to my colleague, Larry Diamond at Stanford. We've done several projects together, and he thought, yes, this is really interesting. So the challenge for us was twofold. How do we keep the microchip supply chain going, even if something happens in the Taiwan Straits? And second, how do we best as Americans and as an American government support Taiwan?
That's great. So, Larry, do you want to say anything or?
No, I think ORVILLE has captured it. Another way of expressing it is that people often say chips are the new oil. World economy can't function without them. All advanced industrial economies and most other economies can't function without them. No computer or mobile phone can function without them. So disruption in this supply chain could be catastrophic for every dimension of our contemporary lives.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting about this book is that compared to all these other conversations around semiconductor, is actually, this assumption about China's intention. And, a few years ago, I remember the two of you co-authored another report, China's Global Sharp Power, which was, I was telling ORVILLE, was one of the very first, in my view, the major narrative change to examine China's intention and influence. That at that time, I was in America in a less positive way, right? And since then, we've seen a real shift of attitude toward China in the media, in Washington, D.C., and other Western capitals. And Silicon Triangle kind of continues that assumption of China's, I would say, less friendly intention, zeroing in on semiconductors and, thinking about China's economic and security coercion. So I guess the question for both of you is, what is your main message to the readers and the world through this book?
Well, you mentioned a very interesting word, intentions. What are China's intentions? And I think here, we'd have to say that originally when engagement was born, which was the US policy of embracing China and trying to bring it into the global marketplace, the world community, China's intentions were pretty good, maybe a little ambiguous about what it wanted to be. And the semiconductor world, which in my view is sort of the symbol par excellence of globalization, because what does it suggest? It suggests that we all need these things, but we can make them any place. In fact, we can share supply chains with people who have different political systems and different histories, different cultures, et cetera, et cetera. That was engagement, but that presupposed that China's intentions were fundamentally, let's put it this way, at least not antagonistic to those who lived in the liberal democratic world like Taiwan and America and Europe. That changed. So in a certain sense, behind our report lies a shift in intentions. And I think this shift in intentions really is personified by Xi Jinping's policies, where he, more than anybody, and I've been watching leaders since Mao Zedong, but certainly Deng Xiaoping, Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, all of their intentions were somewhat more friendly, albeit ambiguous. But Xi Jinping, I think, began to emphasize the hostile foreign forces aspect of China's relationship with America and Taiwan. And that's what really destroyed, in my view, globalization and threatens the global commons that make microprocessors.
Yeah, I think, Wen-Chi, that another way of capturing the message of this book is to look at each point of the triangle. For the United States, we have hard thinking to do about our economic and military security. We cannot allow the supply of the most critical input to all our modern technology, both economic, informational, social, and military, to be controlled or cut off by an aggressive People's Republic of China, not to mention one that at some point we might find ourselves in military conflict with. And we can't tolerate a world in which our allies can be brought to their knees by such supply chain deliberate disruptions as well. So the security of supply chains is critical. That's the first point. The second point on the triangle is Taiwan. And what we make clear in this volume is that we have overriding moral and geopolitical reasons to ensure that Taiwan can be safe and secure and determine its own future without compulsion across the strait, independent of the critical role that Taiwan is playing in the global semiconductor supply chain. But that role obviously accentuates it. And so the need to think about how Taiwan can be safe and secure, and the kind of American and extended democratic commitment to it can be assured at the same time that we diversify global supply chains for semiconductors. That kind of speaks to the second point in the triangle. And the third point in the triangle is the People's Republic of China. It's not our goal to keep China down. It's not our intrinsic goal to suppress its competitiveness or economic or technological innovation. Our goal is to ensure that China plays by the rules, first of all, including the rules of the International Trading Order, which ban the dumping of commodities in the pursuit of monopoly control of world trade, number one. And number two, to ensure that China doesn't use both technology capture, inappropriate theft of intellectual property, and any other means to acquire a technological advantage in semiconductors that could be translated, as all of its technology is translated, into military modernization. We can't live in a world, Taiwan certainly can't survive in a world where China has a technologically military superiority. And that's not because we're anti-China. It's because we're anti a neo-totalitarian regime that has opened the possibility of using force to resolve this conflict across the strait.
Well, thank you. I think both of you actually touched on, this point that, obviously security is of a huge concern in this overall conversation around semiconductor. And ORVILLE, you also mentioned, Xi Jinping, or under Xi Jinping, the policies really changed, from China's perspective, from more of the embracing liberal trade order to a different kind, right? So I would call it, I would just say it's weaponization of economic and business assets. And I think that's become the new frontier of the great power competition, which is really a pivot from a liberal trade order that, most of us have been used to over the last few decades. And the Trump administration really, right, started this new era of trade war in the name of national economic security, and the Biden administration kind of continues it, but in a more, in my view, more thoughtful and strategic kind of industrial policy approach. And in a chapter written by Robert Daly and Matt Turbin, they both suggested that the market alone cannot address many of the security concerns. And I guess my question back to both of you, wish, Turbin and Daly can be here as well. To what extent can these policies based on security concerns be effective and beneficial to the people? Because right now it feels like everything is in the name of security. But is it good for the people?
Well, to start with your first question, can the market solve almost everything or a lot of things? We did go through a period where I think the world did believe we traded more. We became more dependent on each other, more familiar with each other, more comfortable with each other. It would lead to maybe slow sort of convergence, even politically, so that our ideological systems might become a little more similar, certainly not the same. But, that was a nice dream. That was the dream of engagement. And your president, Ma Ying-jeou, had his version of the dream, right?
Former president, yes.
Former president, that if you just trade, send Terry Gou over to China, hire 400,000 Chinese in Zhengzhou, do an Apple plant, Foxconn, then we'll wear down the antagonism and we'll slowly learn to get along. Well, that dream, I would say, has pretty much come a cropper now. And it's a pity. It's an enormous tragedy, actually. But I think we've all kind of learned that trade alone isn't a sufficient elixir to cure what is actually an incredibly extreme ideological political divide between a Marxist-Leninist one-party state and a liberal democracy. Every country has their weaknesses and fallibilities. But so now we're at the state where trade didn't do it. Market sharing didn't cure many of the contradictions we hoped it would. And we find that actually political systems really matter. If you have a leader that is a dyed-in-the-wool Leninist, that's not easy to get along with it if you believe in Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, or Sun Yat-sen, or Jiang Jingguo, or anybody who espoused a form of liberal democracy.
But to what extent, maybe this is for Larry to answer, to what extent can all these policies, based on security concerns, can be effective and beneficial to the people and the market?
Well, they're not only based on security concerns. A lot of our policies are based actually on making the market work. Right now, we have a lot of market distortions in the United States because of the heavy burden of regulation and taxation, which is making semiconductor manufacturing in the United States actually not terribly competitive and making it very difficult to build manufacturing plants. TSMC is certainly encountering some frustrations in this regard. So a lot of our report actually involves removing market distortions and putting manufacturing in the United States on a much more level playing field with Europe, with Taiwan, and so on. That is not to supplant Taiwan, it's to supplement Taiwan. And it may well be, as it is with the Arizona plant for TSMC, actually quite literally in partnership with Taiwan and with TSMC.
Where we were coming out of the Davos world of win-win-win,
Yes.
globalization, all good. Everybody can trade with everybody. It doesn't really matter what kind of government you have, and that I think is ending, and we're not quite sure what will replace it. What I think probably is going to replace it is a sort of the oil and water are separating, and you're going to find blocks that not only have political commons, Putin and Iran and China and North Korea and countries like that, but also that they will there'll be some separation of the market too. We may have a bifurcated market, and again, microchips is the personification,
Yeah,
the metaphor, if you will, for the way in which the market is dividing.
but I do, since both of you kind of mentioned that, the onshoring of TSMC, you both must know that, in Taiwan, the decision of TSMC's major investments in Arizona and also the relocation of a lot of engineers and, just a lot of the movement, the decision actually has been debated quite a bit in Taiwan, right? So some question or are concerned about the U.S. friendshoring policy. Some even would go far to say it is almost some kind of coercion, because it is a big risk for TSMC to, on one hand, obviously to concentrate so much of this manufacturing in Taiwan, but on the other hand, it's also a big risk to divest and invest in Arizona, where it may not have that kind of ecosystem. I want to ask, what are your views?
Well, the Arizona investment, of course, every new plant involves some degree of risk, right? You're laying down capital and making a bet on the future. When you're doing it in a new economic and social and regulatory context, then it's a somewhat greater risk. As a proportion of all the capital that TSMC has to invest in the next decade, I would say the Arizona plan is, I don't want to minimize it, it's significant, but it's still a relatively moderate risk for TSMC. And I think one of the things that gives Taiwanese pause and perhaps some degree of anxiety is they're thinking, oh my God, if we transfer a significant proportion of our manufacturing capacity in semiconductors to the United States, will they still value us? Will they still be there for us? And I think the point that needs to be made is emphatically yes, for several reasons. Number one, as we said in our report, whatever degree of friendshoring is going to happen in the United States is going to be relatively modest, both as a share of total world semiconductor manufacturing, as a share of our needs, and as a share of what Taiwan is producing. The lion's share of global manufacturing is going to remain with Taiwan. Secondly, even TSMC realizes it needs to diversify more its sites of production because it's reaching certain limits in terms of electricity, land, labor supply, and so on and so forth. So TSMC in the years to come will need to diversify somewhere. The United States probably will be one of several places
Yeah.
Japan will be another, and I think there'll be others, possibly
Germany,
and
yeah.
so on. The
Right.
third point to be made, and I actually think it's the most important point to be made, is that the United States and we need to be better at conveying this, the United States commitment to ensuring that the people of Taiwan will not be coerced into some kind of future that they don't consent to, does not primarily rest on Taiwan's crucial role in the global semiconductor supply chain. It rests on our shared values and on our shared commitment to democracy and the importance for the future of freedom and democracy in the world, that one of the world's most impressive democracies not be swallowed by the world's most powerful neo-totalitarian state.
You know, let me just add a little footnote here. I think I know many in Taiwan are a little fearful if TSMC goes off to Europe and America. The silicon shield, if it actually exists, may be weakened in terms of Taiwan's ability to protect itself. But actually, I think what we are seeing is something that is very much in Taiwan's advantage and interest, namely that it is becoming important to the United States and Europe in ways that it wasn't when it was just making, fire tongs and, just consumer goods. So that by moving a fab to Arizona, maybe one to Germany and Japan, suddenly Taiwan is saying, we are real. We have something to offer.
But on the contrary, if I can just play the devil's advocate, you've seen, for example, a few, presidential candidates in the primary elections, basically saying, well, Taiwan is so important when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing. So let's make sure, we have their technologies and capability. But, until the US is capable of producing most advanced chips, then, we don't have to worry about Taiwan. I think it's those statements that truly worry. I mean, obviously people don't know that much about American domestic politics, so don't know how to even make judgment about these types of statements. But it does sound not that positive to people in Taiwan.
Well, I think they have to get a little more realistic about what it means. What it means to me is that TSMC is the Foxconn that went to America instead of to China. Is going to build up another kind of dependency and another kind of helps the alliance structure have some real meaning. Now, Taiwan's just a poor little shivering island waiting for the Seventh Fleet to come in and defend it. That's not a great situation. But here, Taiwan has some cards to play. I think they're playing them quite well, and I think it will tie the U.S., Europe, and Japan closer to Taiwan rather than remove a deterrent that Taiwan needs to depend on by having it the full complement of leading edge chips fabbed in Taiwan.
Yeah. I wanted to also, discuss a really interesting concept that Matt Pottinger's chapter discussed, constrainment. He explained that a constrainment is a policy to prevent China from accumulating the means to capture a large market share and then cut off the flow to democracies. Basically, he wants to prevent China from being the OPEC of chips. Which is a really interesting concept. And I think we see that kind of concern manifested in the various export controls by the Biden administration. However, just a few weeks ago, Huawei's, Mate 60, which is a new phone that surprised the world. It seems to be a blow to those policies. How do you look at that?
Well, there's only so much we can do to constrain China. They've got their own technological impetus, their own talent, their own innovation system. But there are multiple things we can do to ensure a level playing field and to prevent the kind of OPEC of semiconductors residing on the Chinese mainland. The first thing that needs to be stressed is that they can't be allowed to massively subsidize their semiconductor industry and enable that industry to dump chips at below market prices and not have a response under international trading rules. Under international trading rules, dumping can be met with countervailing duties. And that's one of the things we discussed. And if China is going to play that game, they're going to face countervailing duties, and not just from the United States, by the way. The second thing is we can't just let them steal our technology. And so we need much tougher rules in place to protect our intellectual property, as well as to impose import controls, and controls not only on investment in China, but Chinese investment in the United States that might gain access to some of our most sophisticated semiconductor designs.
But do you think that kind of policy can truly slow down, maybe not entirely stop China from developing or accelerating even its technology advancement?
Yeah, slow is the operative word. All we can do is prevent them from having unfair competitive advantages and use the time and space that policy tools will buy us to be better, swifter, more effective in winning this technological race, and winning it in partnership with Taiwan. That's absolutely critical to emphasize. This increasingly will be a partnership in design, manufacturing, all sorts of things. It will be industry in Taiwan and industry in the US and in Japan and Europe working together.
So basically, allied countries will become much more integrated in this semiconductor manufacturing bloc.
Yes, democracies.
Yeah.
I think you already see that. What's so interesting, I mean, the major players are, of course, Taiwan, China, Japan,
South Korea, Japan,
and the United States, and to some degree Holland, and, with ASML making these, these extreme ultraviolet lithography machines.
Right.
I think that the shift that is happening is part of this whole global shift that's happening, and technology is going to follow it. And yes, China has a lot of very talented, able designers, but it's very interesting if you look at a company in China like SenseTime that was making surveillance equipment. So they sort of sold all the surveillance cameras they could to local governments, and that market kind of bottomed out. So they went into AI, but they needed, NVIDIA chips, and now they can't get them. So, I mean, that AI is an important aspect not only of industry, but also the military. So we see that there are some choke points here that I think we are obliged to very sensibly and in a temperate manner look at. And if it is in the national security interest of the United States or one of our allies, partners, and friends, then I think we are really compelled to act.
Well, I know this book was published before the Middle East crisis. And now that, looking at what is happening in the Middle East, do you think that's changing any of the conversation?
It's such a mess. And it was bad enough when it was just Putin, Xi, and the United and Biden, and now we have this third forest fire raging that we're not quite sure who, if anyone, could help control it or stop it. And then Ukraine gets kind of forgotten. And this is the way, world wars begin.
Yeah.
Very alarming.
I think that everything we see suggests that the PRC and the PLA do not consider themselves really ready to play the military card against Taiwan now. You never know, and you always have to be vigilant. I think if there was going to be a preoccupying crisis with significant military commitments by the United States in the Middle East, better that it's happening now than 4 or 5 years from now. But it's a wake-up call, and yet another reason why I personally think we need a bigger United States Navy, and why, as we called for in our report, we need to license the production of some of these critical weapons systems to Taiwan industry so that the backlog on weapons delivery can be diminished and the flow of defensive weapons to Taiwan can be accelerated.
But it sounds like, sorry, but sounds like both of you do worry, even though, you know, you may question the likelihood or the chance may be low, but you do worry there may be a third front across the Taiwan Strait.
I think everyone has to worry whether it's an accident that leads to a higher, rate of higher level of conflict. But I think it's important to remember, and I think Larry would share this sentiment with me, we are all refugees from the policy of engagement. That was the hope of slow convergence. It isn't that we have an innate hostility towards China, that it sort of has now had a chance to spring forth like Athena out of the head of Zeus and just try to strangle China. No. I mean, I married a Chinese woman. My kids speak Chinese. I spent half my life in China. It's with a great sense of sadness and an immense sense that I'm watching a tragedy of monumental proportions unfolding as Xi Jinping does exactly what he doesn't, he shouldn't be doing, because he's creating the very environment he most fears, which is hostile foreign forces outside. And these forces did not used to be hostile.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, how did that come to pass? Why is this happening? And then, of course, the next critical question is, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
I think the best thing to be done is deterrence.
And of course, in a few months, Taiwan will have the presidential election, which I believe Beijing is also watching very closely, and the rest of the world. And do you think that will change the triangle relationship?
Well, of course, it depends on who wins the election. We know who Beijing doesn't want to win the election. I think that's fairly obvious. But I think whoever is elected president in Taiwan, they will be very soberly aware of the volatility of the situation and the importance of choosing words and actions very carefully. So what I think we will not see after the January election and after the inauguration in May is a new president of Taiwan, whoever he will be, who will take provocative steps and actions that might make the situation worse. I think at a minimum, we will see a very conscious and careful effort to preserve the status quo.
Any view on that, Orville?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And here, I think, President Biden gets much criticism, but I think he's done a pretty artful job, on the one hand, of pushing back and not being spineless, but on the other hand, keeping the door open. We sent 4 cabinet secretaries over. Now we have Wang Yi in Washington, sort of the latest version.
So will Xi-Biden summit happen?
I think it looks like it's going to, but you have to ask, well, if it's going to happen, could they change the terms of the game in any meaningful way? I seriously doubt it, but it's a really good thing that they're at least talking. And at least maybe they'll answer the phone if there's a dust up in the South China Sea or something. So it's not bad, but we are frozen.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of a ice field here where Xi Jinping does not see that he has the latitude because he fears that any kind of compromise will look like weakness. But that's the art of diplomacy. You give a little and you get a little, and you work it out. But this is not the strong suit of what Xi Jinping's regime is able to do. So it's a very dangerous time. I think if I were Xi Jinping or an advisor to him, I'd say, listen, don't miss the chance of Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan. You may not have another chance like this to find an off-ramp. And then what happens? Your whole amazing economic boom and miracle could come crashing down around your ears. Why? For what? For absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Any last words, Larry, you want to say about Xi Biden summit? What do you expect to come out of the summit?
I am not good at predicting. I think Xi Jinping is facing an enormous number of problems now. Mm-hmm. The economy is doing significantly worse than is being reported, and what's being reported isn't very good. He has alienated most of the entrepreneurial class, and many of them are increasingly focused on how they can get their money and their families out of China and even turn their back on the country. A lot of their efforts at propaganda and sharp power haven't paid off as they've hoped. A lot of people around the world are realizing they've been left with a heavy debt burden and are becoming resentful of it. He's got a lot of problems he has to attend to. It would be truly disastrous, on the order of what Putin has done in Ukraine or worse, if he decided to play a coercion card in the next 2-3 years in Taiwan. So the key is the combination of deterrence, patience, non-provocation, and looking for some positive ways to find areas of cooperation and mutual understanding.
Now, let me just make a final comment here to say that it's pretty gloomy times, but I've been watching China for God, how many decades, I don't want to say. And what you see right now in China is not the total picture. Mm-hmm. China is filled with all sorts of contending forces that wax and wane and rise and fall. And we've seen it over the last 7-8 decades. And it's going to happen again. When, we don't know. But China is not simply a neo-Maoist state with everybody marching in lockstep behind Xi Jinping. And those other forces which have expressed themselves in the late 70s, the early 80s, the 90s, the May 4th movement, I mean, again and again and again, they will reappear. And we just have to hold out and try to prevent ourselves from running the train over the cliff until that moment.
Yeah. Well, this is why I think, both of you, thank you so much for publishing this book. And also, in my view, it introduces a really interesting concept, which is economic deterrence. We've talked a lot about military deterrence, but I think this is an economic deterrence that's manifested in semiconductor chips. So thank you again for publishing such a timely and informative book with such impressive authors. And TVBS looks forward to bringing this book to Taiwan in Chinese very soon. So take care.
We do as well. Thank you.
Yeah.